The drill whirred to life in Jeffrey Dahmer's hands, its sharp bit gleaming under the dim apartment light as he leaned over his victim. The young man on the bed was still breathing, still alive, but unconscious. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing methods ever documented in criminal history. Dahmer wasn't trying to kill him. Not yet. He was trying to create something else entirely, something that would make his victim stay forever. He drilled a small hole into the skull, then poured hydrochloric acid directly into the brain. This wasn't the act of a man who had suddenly snapped. This was Jeffrey Dahmer, and he had been building toward this moment for years. Who was Jeffrey Dahmer? How does a seemingly ordinary man transform into someone capable of murdering 17 young men and boys? What drives a person to not just kill, but to dismember, photograph, and in some cases, consume parts of their victims? The answers are more complex and disturbing than most people imagine, and understanding Dahmer's story means diving into one of the darkest minds in American criminal history. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the outside, the Dahmer family appeared normal, perhaps even privileged. Lionel was a research chemist working on his PhD, and Joyce was a teletype machine instructor. They lived in a comfortable home, and by all accounts, baby Jeffrey was a happy, normal child. His father would later describe him as an energetic boy who loved being the center of attention. But something changed, and the question that haunted everyone who knew the family was simple. When did it start? And why? The first crack in Jeffrey's seemingly normal childhood appeared around age 4, when he underwent surgery for a double hernia. His mother, Joyce, was pregnant with his younger brother, David, at the time, and some psychologists have theorized that Jeffrey may have felt abandoned during this vulnerable period. After the surgery, family members noticed a shift. The once vibrant and outgoing boy became increasingly withdrawn. He would sit for hours, barely moving, staring into space with an expression his father described as distant and unreachable. Was this the moment something fundamental changed in Jeffrey Dahmer's brain? Or was there something deeper, something already present that was simply waiting to emerge? As Jeffrey grew older, his parents' marriage deteriorated into constant fighting. Joyce Dahmer suffered from depression and anxiety, often staying in bed for days at a time. Lionel threw himself into his work, leaving young Jeffrey to navigate the toxic home environment largely on his own. The boy who had once craved attention learned to make himself invisible. He discovered that the safest place was in his own head, in his own world, where he had complete control. But what was happening in that world? What thoughts were taking root in the mind of a lonely, isolated child? By age 10, Jeffrey had developed a fascination that would define his entire life. Dead animals. It started innocently enough. He found a dead dog by the roadside and was mesmerized by the bones, the structure, the permanence of death compared to the chaos of life. His father, a chemist, showed him how to use chemicals to bleach and preserve animal bones. Lionel thought he was encouraging his son's interest in science, perhaps nurturing a future biologist or doctor. He had no idea he was providing the tools and knowledge that Jeffrey would later use on human victims. Jeffrey began collecting roadkill, dead squirrels, cats, dogs, anything he could find. He would take them to a small shed behind the family home, a place he called his laboratory, and spend hours dissecting them, studying them, arranging their bones. But it wasn't just scientific curiosity, was it? Years later, Dahmer would admit that even at this young age, he was experiencing something else alongside the fascination with death. He was beginning to have fantasies, dark thoughts that combined violence, control, and sex in ways that terrified even him. He knew these thoughts were wrong. He knew he was different from other children. So he buried these feelings deep, told no one, and continued his experiments in secret. The question everyone would later ask was unavoidable. Could Jeffrey Dahmer have been stopped at this point? If someone had recognized the warning signs, could 17 lives have been saved? Jeffrey's teenage years were marked by increasing isolation and his first experiences with alcohol. He started drinking heavily at age 14, smuggling booze to school in a coffee cup, downing entire six-packs before class. His classmates noticed his strange behavior but mostly found it amusing. Jeffrey became known as the class clown, doing bizarre things for attention, faking epileptic seizures in the hallways, making strange noises during class. His friends even formed a Dahmer fan club, treating his antics as harmless entertainment. But beneath the performance, Jeffrey was drowning. He later described feeling completely numb, dead inside, and alcohol was the only thing that made him feel anything at all. During these same years, Jeffrey's sexual fantasies became more specific and more disturbing. He realized he was attracted to men, which in 1970s Ohio was something he felt he could never reveal. But his attraction wasn't normal desire. It was mixed inextricably with violence and death. He fantasized about having a completely passive, submissive partner, someone who would never leave him, never reject him. He began fantasizing about rendering men unconscious so he could lie with them, touch them, possess them completely. The fantasy escalated. What if they never woke up? What if he could keep them forever? At age 16, Jeffrey nearly acted on these fantasies. He planned to attack a male jogger who regularly ran past his house, hiding in the bushes with a baseball bat, waiting to knock the man unconscious and drag him into the woods. On the day he finally worked up the courage to do it, the jogger didn't run by. Jeffrey waited for hours, but the man never appeared. Was this a missed opportunity for Jeffrey, or was it the universe giving him one last chance to turn back? Either way, the moment passed, and Jeffrey continued living with his dark fantasies, drinking himself into oblivion every day, maintaining the facade of a troubled but harmless teenager. In 1978, everything exploded. Jeffrey's parents' marriage finally collapsed completely. His mother Joyce moved out, taking Jeffrey's younger brother David with her. Lionel had already moved out months earlier to be with his new girlfriend. Jeffrey, 18 years old and fresh out of high school, was left completely alone in the family home. No supervision, no structure, no one checking on him. He had complete freedom, and he had been left behind by everyone he knew. The abandonment was total. For weeks, Jeffrey lived alone in that house, drinking constantly, the silence broken only by his own thoughts. And those thoughts were getting louder, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. His name was Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker. Jeffrey picked him up, invited him back to his house for beer and music, and for a few hours, everything seemed normal. They drank, talked, listened to music. Stephen was friendly, relaxed, treating Jeffrey like a regular guy. But when Stephen said he needed to leave, something inside Jeffrey snapped. The idea of Stephen walking out that door, of being alone again, was unbearable. Jeffrey picked up a dumbbell and struck Stephen twice in the head, killing him. What happened next revealed the true depths of Jeffrey Dahmer's pathology. He didn't panic. He didn't immediately try to dispose of the body. Instead, he engaged in necrophilia with the corpse, acting out fantasies he had been harboring for years. Over the following days, he dissected the body in his crawl space, stripped the flesh from the bones, and smashed the bones into small pieces with a sledgehammer. He scattered the remains in the woods behind his house. The whole process was methodical, careful, and shockingly calm. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of temporary insanity. This was something Jeffrey had been preparing for, perhaps unconsciously, for years. After killing Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey didn't kill again for 9 years. Why? What stopped him? Jeffrey later claimed that the experience horrified him, that he realized how far he had gone and tried desperately to control his urges. His father, not knowing about the murder, pushed him to join the military, hoping structure and discipline would help his troubled son. Jeffrey enlisted in the Army in 1979 and was trained as a medical specialist. For a while, it seemed like it might work, but Jeffrey continued drinking heavily, and after just 2 years, the Army discharged him for alcohol abuse. He returned to Ohio briefly, then moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. For the next several years, Jeffrey's life fell into a pattern of minor legal troubles and increasing dysfunction. He was arrested for indecent exposure in 1982 and again in 1986. He lost job after job because of his drinking. His grandmother, a deeply religious woman who took him in out of love, had no idea what was living under her roof. Jeffrey kept his darkest urges suppressed, but the pressure was building. The fantasies never stopped. They only grew stronger, more detailed, more consuming. He later described feeling like two people, the outer Jeffrey who tried to function in society, and the inner Jeffrey who craved control, possession, and death. In September 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. His victim was Stephen Tuomi, whom he met at a gay bar. Jeffrey rented a hotel room and, according to his later statements, he didn't plan to kill Stephen. They drank heavily together, and Jeffrey claimed he woke up the next morning to find Stephen dead, his chest crushed, with no memory of what happened. Whether this was true or a convenient lie to distance himself from the act, Jeffrey now had another body to deal with. He bought a large suitcase, stuffed Stephen's body inside, and took a taxi back to his grandmother's house. Once there, he dismembered the body, disposed of most of the remains in the trash, but kept the skull temporarily before pulverizing it. The 9-year gap had ended. The floodgates were open. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer would kill 15 more young men and boys. Each murder followed a similar pattern, but the details grew progressively more disturbing. Jeffrey would meet his victims at gay bars, shopping malls, or bus stops. He targeted men who were often marginalized, young men of color, men from poor backgrounds, men whose disappearances might not immediately trigger massive police investigations. Was this deliberate targeting or simple opportunity? Jeffrey later claimed he wasn't thinking about police at all, that he simply went to places where he could meet potential victims. His method was consistent and calculated. He would offer money for nude photographs, or simply invite men back to his apartment for drinks. Once there, he would drug them, usually with sleeping pills dissolved in alcohol. Then, when they were unconscious or nearly so, he would strangle them. After death, he would engage in necrophilia, photograph the bodies in various poses, and then begin the process of dismemberment. He became skilled at it, developing a routine. He kept photographs of each victim, creating an album of death that he would use later for sexual gratification. He kept body parts as souvenirs, storing skulls, genitals, and other remains in his apartment. The apartment became a nightmare, a factory of death operating in plain sight in a normal Milwaukee neighborhood. But why? What was Jeffrey trying to achieve? In his later interviews with psychologists, Dahmer explained that he was trying to create compliant partners who would never leave him. The drilling experiments, the acid poured into brains, these weren't attempts to kill, but attempts to create living zombies who would be completely obedient and unable to abandon him. The attempt failed every time. The victims always died, but Jeffrey kept trying, kept refining his technique, convinced that eventually he would succeed. The core of Dahmer's pathology wasn't sadism in the traditional sense. He didn't torture his victims or take pleasure in their pain. In fact, he drugged them to ensure they didn't suffer. His obsession was control and permanence, finding a way to possess another person completely and forever. The most chilling aspect of Dahmer's killing spree was how many times he almost got caught, how many opportunities existed to stop him, and how he slipped through every time. In September 1988, he was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Synthesomphone. Jeffrey was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but after serving only 10 months, he was released on good behavior in March 1990. His father hired a lawyer who successfully convinced the judge that Jeffrey was a sick man who needed treatment, not punishment. Jeffrey convinced everyone, including his probation officer, that he was getting better, attending therapy, controlling his drinking. Behind closed doors, he resumed killing almost immediately. In May 1991, Jeffrey encountered 14-year-old Conorak Synthesomphone, the younger brother of the boy he had molested years earlier. Conorak didn't recognize Jeffrey or know his connection to his brother. Jeffrey lured Conorak to his apartment, drugged him, drilled a hole in his skull, and poured acid into his brain, attempting his zombie experiment again. But something went wrong. While Jeffrey was out buying beer, Konorak woke up, disoriented and bleeding, and escaped onto the street. 3 young women found him, naked and incoherent, and called 911. Police arrived, and Jeffrey emerged from his apartment, calm and believable. He told police that Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had simply had a lover's quarrel after drinking too much. Despite the young women's protests that the boy was clearly underage and seriously injured, despite the fact that Konorak couldn't speak coherently, the police believed Jeffrey. They helped Jeffrey escort Konorak back to the apartment. One officer even made a joke about needing to delousing after the encounter, a comment captured on police recordings. Once the police left, Jeffrey strangled Konorak and dismembered his body. If those police officers had looked around the apartment, if they had checked Jeffrey's record, if they had listened to those 3 women, Konorak would have lived, and at least 4 subsequent victims would never have died. The failures that allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to continue killing revealed systemic problems in how police dealt with LGBTQ individuals and people of color. Jeffrey deliberately chose victims from marginalized communities, and the police response to missing person reports was often minimal. When concerned family members tried to report their loved ones missing, they were frequently told that the young men had probably just run off or were involved in drugs. The police didn't take these disappearances seriously, and Jeffrey knew it. He operated with a sense of confidence bordering on arrogance, convinced he would never be caught. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey's apartment at 924 North 25th Street was a house of horrors. His refrigerator contained human heads. His freezer held bags of organs and flesh. He had a barrel of acid where he was dissolving bodies. He kept a complete skeleton in his closet. Photographs of dismembered corpses lined his drawers. The smell was overwhelming, a sickly sweet stench of death that permeated the building. Neighbors complained repeatedly about the odor, and Jeffrey explained it away as his freezer breaking and meat going bad. The smell was so bad that one neighbor left packages of air freshener outside Jeffrey's door. But no one looked inside. No one imagined what could actually be producing that smell. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer approached 32-year-old Tracy Edwards outside a shopping mall, offering him money to come back to his apartment for photographs and drinks. Tracy agreed, and once inside, the evening started normally. But when Jeffrey snapped a handcuff on Tracy's wrist, pulled out a knife, and told Tracy he was going to eat his heart, Tracy realized he was in mortal danger. For over 2 hours, Tracy kept Jeffrey talking, complying just enough to avoid triggering violence while looking for any opportunity to escape. When Jeffrey became distracted by his favorite scene in The Exorcist 3, Tracy punched him in the face and ran out the door, his hand still in one handcuff. Tracy flagged down a police car, screaming that a man had tried to kill him. 2 officers, Rolf Mueller and Robert Routh, followed Tracy back to Jeffrey's apartment. When Jeffrey answered the door, he was calm, apologetic, explaining it was just a misunderstanding. But the officers asked for the key to the handcuffs, and when Jeffrey couldn't produce it immediately, they pushed past him into the apartment. Officer Mueller opened the refrigerator to grab a beer, and instead found a human head staring back at him. The nightmare was finally over. The subsequent search of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment revealed horrors beyond imagination. Police found 4 severed heads in the refrigerator, 7 skulls in the bedroom and closet, 2 human hearts in the freezer, a torso and other organs in the freezer, and photographs documenting the entire process of murder and dismemberment. They found hands, genitals, and multiple jars of preserved organs. The barrel of acid contained 3 torsos in various stages of dissolution. Altogether, the remains of 11 victims were found in that apartment. The investigating officers were traumatized, several requiring psychological counseling after processing the scene. One officer later said it was like walking into hell itself, that the images of what he saw that night would never leave his mind. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested and, surprisingly, confessed to everything almost immediately. He waived his right to an attorney initially and spent hours detailing his crimes to police, showing them where he had hidden remains, explaining his methods, his motivations, his complete history of murder. Why did he confess so readily? According to his own statements, he was relieved it was over. He was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of the constant fear of being caught. He told police he knew what he was doing was wrong, that he had tried to stop himself multiple times but couldn't. The urges were too strong, the fantasies too consuming. He described feeling like a passenger in his own body, watching himself do terrible things while some part of him screamed to stop. The question of Jeffrey Dahmer's sanity became central to his trial. His defense attorneys argued for an insanity plea, claiming that someone who committed such incomprehensible acts must be legally insane. But the prosecution argued that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, that his careful planning, his efforts to avoid detection, and his ability to maintain a normal facade proved he understood right from wrong. They brought in forensic psychologists who testified that Dahmer suffered from various personality disorders and paraphilias, but that he was legally sane according to Wisconsin law. Jeffrey himself admitted he was not insane in the legal sense. He testified that he knew his actions were wrong, that he knew they were criminal, but that he felt compelled to do them anyway. He described it as an addiction more powerful than any drug, a need that overrode every other consideration. The jury deliberated for just 5 hours before finding Jeffrey Dahmer guilty but sane on all 15 murder counts in Wisconsin. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 937 years in prison. There would be no possibility of parole, no chance of freedom. Jeffrey Dahmer would die in prison. But the story doesn't end with Jeffrey's conviction. The families of his victims faced unimaginable grief and anger. Many felt the justice system had failed their sons and brothers by not taking their disappearances seriously, by not investigating sooner, by believing Jeffrey's lies over their concerns. Rita Isbell, sister of victim Errol Lindsay, gave an emotional victim impact statement at Jeffrey's sentencing, lunging at him and screaming about the pain he had caused. Her raw grief captured what all the families felt, an agony that could never be fully expressed or relieved. These weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were sons who had futures, brothers who were loved, young men whose lives were stolen by someone who saw them only as objects to possess. The victims themselves deserve to be remembered, not just as Dahmer's prey, but as individuals with their own stories, dreams, and potential. Stephen Hicks was hitchhiking to a rock concert. Stephen Tomey was a Michigan native who worked at a restaurant. Jamie Dockstader was only 14 years old. Richard Guerrero had recently moved from Mexico to build a better life. Anthony Sears was an aspiring model. Raymond Smith was a sex worker trying to survive. Ernest Miller was a dance student with dreams of performing professionally. David Thomas was a father. Curtis Straughter was an aspiring model who had just moved to Milwaukee. Errol Lindsay was seeking opportunities in a new city. Tony Hughes was deaf and had overcome significant obstacles in his life. Konarak Synthesomphone was just 14, with his entire life ahead of him. Matt Turner was visiting from Chicago. Jeremiah Weinberger had recently become comfortable with his sexuality. Oliver Lacey was a track star and father of 2. Joseph Braidhoft was a father of 3, trying to find work. Each had value beyond their role in Jeffrey Dahmer's story, and they should not be forgotten. Jeffrey Dahmer spent less than 3 years in prison. Initially held in solitary confinement for his own protection, he was eventually moved to general population at his own request. Jeffrey claimed he had found religion in prison, becoming a born-again Christian and requesting baptism. Some saw this as genuine remorse and transformation. Others saw it as yet another manipulation. Jeffrey playing the role expected of him, just as he had played the role of normal neighbor, cooperative employee, and troubled but harmless drunk. The truth of his conversion remains debated, but what is certain is that many inmates wanted him dead. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death in the prison bathroom by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Scarver, serving a life sentence for murder, claimed that God had told him to kill Dahmer. He attacked Jeffrey with a metal bar from the prison weight room, crushing his skull. Another inmate, Jesse Anderson, was also killed in the attack. Jeffrey Dahmer died at age 34, less than 3 years into his sentence. Some saw it as justice, as appropriate punishment for someone who had caused such horror. Others saw it as a failure of the prison system to protect even the most reviled inmates. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, expressed grief at his son's death, maintaining until the end that he loved Jeffrey despite his unspeakable crimes. The aftermath of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes rippled far beyond the victims and their families. The Milwaukee Police Department faced serious criticism and multiple lawsuits for their handling of missing person reports and their failure to properly investigate the Konarak synthesophone incident. The officers who returned Konarak to Jeffrey were fired, but later reinstated after appeals. The city of Milwaukee paid settlements to several victims' families. The apartment building where Jeffrey committed most of his murders was demolished, the site left as an empty lot because no one wanted to build there. Jeffrey's belongings, including the refrigerator, the barrel, and his tools of murder, were supposed to be auctioned off, but victims' families fought to have them destroyed instead. A civic group raised money to purchase the items, specifically to incinerate them, ensuring they would never become macabre collector's items. The psychological analysis of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to fascinate and disturb criminologists, psychologists, and the public decades after his death. What combination of factors created such a monster? Was it nature or nurture? Was Jeffrey born with something broken in his brain, or did his environment and experiences shape him into a killer? The consensus among experts is that it was both, a perfect storm of genetic predisposition, childhood trauma, isolation, mental illness, and unchecked paraphilic desires. Jeffrey's case has been studied extensively in criminal psychology courses, analyzed in countless books and documentaries, dissected from every possible angle in attempts to understand how to identify and stop future Jeffrey Dahmers. But perhaps the most important question isn't about understanding Jeffrey Dahmer himself, but about the society that allowed him to kill 17 people over 13 years without being stopped. The failures were systematic and repeated. The police who didn't take missing persons reports seriously, especially when the missing were gay men of color, the officers who returned Konarak synthesophone to his death, the neighbors who smelled death but didn't demand answers, the probation system that released a convicted sex offender after less than a year and never properly supervised him, and the mental health system that never adequately addressed Jeffrey's problems when he was young enough to potentially be helped. Jeffrey Dahmer bears ultimate responsibility for his crimes, but society shares responsibility for creating an environment where those crimes could continue unchecked for so long. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat marginalized communities, about the warning signs we ignore, and about the monsters that can hide in plain sight. Jeffrey wasn't some lurking stranger in dark alleys. He was a neighbor, a co-worker, a classmate. He looked normal. He acted normal most of the time. People who knew him casually described him as quiet, polite, maybe a little strange, but harmless. The banality of his evil is perhaps its most frightening aspect. We want to believe that monsters are obviously monstrous, that we would recognize them if we saw them. But Jeffrey Dahmer proves that isn't true. The greatest predators are often the ones who blend in perfectly, who know how to wear a mask of normalcy while darkness churns beneath. If you've made it this far into this video, you've heard the complete story of Jeffrey Dahmer, from his seemingly normal childhood to his horrific killing spree to his death in prison. The details are disturbing, the psychology is complex, and the systemic failures are frustrating. If this deep dive into criminal psychology interests you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss future videos exploring the darkest corners of human nature. Drop a comment below letting us know what aspect of Dahmer's case you found most disturbing or what other cases you'd like us to cover. And if you found this video informative, hit that like button to help others find it as well. Understanding these cases isn't about glorifying killers, it's about learning from the past to protect the future. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is one of pain, horror, and cautionary lessons. His victims and their families deserve to be remembered with compassion. The failures that allowed his crimes to continue deserve to be studied and corrected. And the uncomfortable questions his case raises about human nature, about the creation of monsters, and about our responsibilities to each other and to the most vulnerable in our society deserve serious consideration. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead, but the lessons from his crimes remain vitally important. Only by understanding what happened and why can we hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future. That is the only meaningful purpose in telling this story, to honor the victims by learning from their deaths and working to ensure that no one else suffers the same fate.